I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. It's not often that a white-collar crime like insider trading captures the public's imagination. But if you were to look at Apple Podcast charts right now, you'll see the number one podcast in the country is on that very topic. If you haven't listened to the podcast The Sure Thing, do it. It's dramatic, it's gripping, and it's 100% true. Angus Grigg is the Australian Financial Review journalist behind the podcast The Sure Thing. Angus, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
For those who don't know the story of Christopher Hill and Lukas Kamay, can you give us a thumbnail sketch?
Yeah, so basically the podcast really charts these two young guys who go to university together at Monash down in Melbourne, and then they meet up 2 years after graduation at a beach party on the Mornington Peninsula. And at that party, one of these guys, Lukas Kamay, mentions to the other guy, Christopher Hill, he could use the information from his job. So at this point, Christopher is working at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, where he's in charge of compiling the economic data for the country. And Lukas, being a fairly aggressive currency trader at the National Australia Bank, he mentions to Chris that, wow, people in my office would love or would kill for that information. And from that sort of one throwaway line, I guess, comes the biggest insider trading heist in Australian history. And I guess what really, the podcast explores is this sort of descent into criminality of these two young guys and how they make a series of decisions along the way to buy illegal burner phones, to then, trade off the information to disguise their identity. And that is that descent into criminality that we really look at in the podcast.
No, it's not giving too much away to say. So Chris was in charge of the unemployment numbers, and what he'd do is get in touch with Lukas just before it came out, and Lukas would make a bet on the foreign exchange, on the Australian dollar, on the basis that knowing that it would move in a certain direction once those figures were out. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. So one of the things we sort of explore is that these were among the most closely guarded statistics in the country, very akin to, the Reserve Bank interest rate decisions in terms of their ability to influence the currency. But actually within the ABS, they weren't particularly closely guarded. There was very poor security around who had access to the information. There was really no effort to try and keep that information confidential beyond making employees sign a sort of declaration when they began work there. And so, what Chris used to do about 3 or 4 days before the numbers were released, he'd literally write them on a scrap of paper, put that scrap in his pocket and walk out the door. And then, he would ring Lukas on his burner phone and communicate these numbers. And then, Lukas, half an hour before, he'd go into the NAB toilet and he'd sit on the dunny with his iPhone and he'd punch in these trades. And, sometimes he was trading up to $450 million of exposure to the Australian dollar.
Amazing. There have been 2 episodes released. They come out every Monday. So the third one is out this coming Monday. What's amazed me is that you got Chris Hill talking on it. That's quite a feat. How did that come about?
Look, through a friend of mine who's an academic at Sydney University, Clinton Free, and he has sort of spent his life traipsing around prisons in the US and Australia, talking to white-collar offenders, trying to better understand the psychology and the rationalisation behind people who, are seemingly law-abiding, descending into criminality. And as part of that, he got to know Chris, and he sort of mentioned to me Chris's case, and then he introduced me to Chris, and I just thought it was such a great story to hear it from the person, the offender's mouth. And so, we just basically thought, let's do a podcast on this. And I think from Chris's perspective, there is an element of trying to sort of recast his story, to put some context around his story. If you Google Chris Hill, you'll get insider trading, but there's no sort of context to that about how essentially he won't blame Lukas, but at the first available opportunity, Lukas betrays Chris. And it's because of that betrayal that ultimately they are caught and go to jail. If not for that betrayal, which came at the very first opportunity, the police and ASIC both sort of agree that they most likely wouldn't have been caught. So Chris, he very much owns his crime. He says that what he did was the wrong thing, but I guess he's trying to put some explanation around, why he did it and try to basically educate others about sort of making really bad decisions when you're young and not thinking about those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, he's brutally honest about himself, Chris, in a really sort of candid manner. It amazes me how he refuses to blame Lukas and he's almost loyal to Lukas.
Yeah, it's a very frustrating part of actually making the podcast because we thought before really getting into it that there would be this sort of tension and animosity between the sort of Chris and Lukas characters, but it never really played out that way. And I think on one level, Chris doesn't want to admit that he was sort of duped or groomed or sort of hoodwinked into this scheme. He doesn't want to look like the person that sort of fell for it. So I think there's a bit of a defense mechanism there. But I think also there is still a loyalty to Lukas. And you've got to remember these guys did, 96 days together in maximum security prison when they were first convicted or when they were first sentenced. And having spent that amount of time in jail together, there is a bond there. And despite whatever they'd been through, when you're two sort of university-educated private schoolboys lumped into one of the toughest prisons in the state, you have to stick together. And I think while they don't talk to each other now, they're not really in contact, there is a sort of loyalty there that when they really needed each other, they were probably there.
Angus, stay with me. We'll be back in a second. My guest this morning is Angus Grigg, Australian Financial Review journalist and host of the Sure Thing podcast. You talked about two well-educated, lucky Australian kids descending into crime. Does it come down to greed or is there more to it?
Look, I think, and this is one of the things we sort of grapple with throughout the podcast, was it always Lukas's intention to betray Chris? And on the balance of things, you look at the evidence, he was never going to accept his half of the $200,000, right? $100,000, pay some tax, take $50,000. This is a guy earning $200,000 a year who'd worked at Goldman Sachs, was now a sort of master of the universe in training at National Australia Bank, as a currency trader. So he was never going to do this for 50 grand. And so I guess on Lukas's side, yes, very much a story of greed and narcissism. On Chris's side, I think the story's a little more complex. I think part of it was he was a bit bored. Part of it was that he wanted to be in sort of Lukas's sort of grace and favor, if you like. I think Lukas was a very charismatic guy. I think, he wanted to be part of sort of Lukas's network, I think. And he enjoyed sort of Lukas's company. And he says that Lukas is the smartest guy he knew. And so he sort of thought, well, this might be a bit of an adventure from my pretty mundane life in Canberra. And, obviously, he just didn't think about it. He had no idea of the consequences. And this is this sort of idea of, young men doing really dumb things.
Is there a moral in the story?
Look, I think there's a couple of things is that, we look at whether society has the capacity to give these guys a second chance, is what we sort of work to at the end of the 6 episodes. And, if you look at the sort of criminal justice system, it's all set up towards rehabilitation. And there's lots of talk of that in court about how these young men have made a mistake. They will make a contribution to society after they serve their time. They've paid their debt to society. And, the reality of Chris's situation now is that he didn't get a 2 years and 3-month jail sentence. He basically got a life sentence. And it's very, very difficult to come back from white-collar crime and to be sort of accepted back into any sort of level of professional responsibility, because I think society does say that the betrayal of society, the trust put in you, that you have had a privileged position, you've gone to a good school, you've been university educated, you've had so many more opportunities than a lot of people, and then you have betrayed that trust, and therefore there really is no second chance often for people like Chris. And I guess he's trying to, in telling his story, trying to say, look, I did a really dumb thing, I've owned up to it, but I'm not a terrible person. And I think that comes through in just his sort of raw honesty throughout the podcast.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We'll be back with more in a minute. I'm talking to journalist Angus Grigg, host of The Sure Thing. Now, Angus, you've been a great business journalist for many years, but you've always been text. Why did you take on a podcast?
Look, I think in terms of long-form storytelling, I don't think there's a better medium around today. I mean, you look at the sort of limitations of doing television, you need lots and lots of pictures. It's very, very production heavy and it's very expensive, right? And it's difficult to tell long-form stories on television, without taking 2 years out to make a sort of documentary series, right? And, the other side of it is, text, while it's very good for sort of telling the story quickly and things like that, you don't feel that sort of human emotion. So I feel like the great value in podcasting and in audio is that you hear it from the people. You hear Chris Hill's voice when he has to ring his dad from jail and say, I need a lawyer. You hear the police when they talk about the moment that their investigation turns and they realize they can get these guys. And so it's just such a rich experience for the listener, I think. And, they can also, the wonderful thing about audio is that the listener takes themselves on their own journey a little bit and they put it into their imagination of how they see these characters and they sort of play the scene out in their own mind. And I think that's really engaging. And people, you look at people who listen to podcasts and, they give you 32 minutes of their time where they're totally engaged with that story. Now, that's very different to often watching television or reading the newspaper where, you are sort of distracted or you stop halfway through. So, I really think that podcasting is sort of the medium that we're going to be telling a lot more stories. And I think I read something the other day that in the US now, I think 100 million people spend, upwards of 40 minutes a day listening to audio on their phones. And that's, I think, overtaken social media for the first time. So it's where the audience is as well, right? People who wouldn't traditionally read newspapers, even watch the news, they will listen to podcasts and they're, excited about finding out what's the new podcast, what's everyone talking about. So as a journalist, I think you need to be there.
So there's plenty more in the future, Angus, podcasts?
Look, I hope so. I mean, someone sort of said to me, what does success look like for one of these podcasts? And I think it's, being able to make another one probably.
You're number one on the Apple podcast charts, though. Were you surprised by the immediate success of it?
Totally surprised. I mean, we've been sort of blown away by the numbers. And I guess part of that is because, yes, it's an insider trading story, but, the vehicle to tell this story is insider trading. Really, it's a story about two young guys and their relationship and the relationship between the police officers and things like that. So it's a human story, really more than a business story. But yeah, look, I mean, also you look around, there's actually not that many Australian podcasts which look at sort of, limited series investigations. A lot of the, top 50 or 60 podcasts in the country are out, they're murders on Long Island or crimes from the US and things like that. So there's not actually a lot of, like on television, there's not a lot of local content being created. And I think, when someone comes along with something sort of hopefully, which is high quality and well produced, then, there's a real appetite for it.
Let's hope there's many more in the future. Angus, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much for having me.
That was Angus Grigg, Australian Financial Review journalist and host of The Sure Thing. The Sure Thing is a 6-part series available from anywhere you access podcasts. Episode 3 is out on Monday.